Desde que se acaba. Perfecto. Sí. Empezamos muy puntuales o damos 5 minutos. 5 minutos. Pensé que usar tenía la palabra en memoria ok. No me tenemos que otro. Bien. El trabajo de mejor algunas cosas. Which kind of translation do you use? Rodeiro?
Yes, that's a lot better than I'm used to, so I actually don't even know how to pronounce my name.
Yeah, for us it's like this.
In the US, it's just Manny. Manny all the time. Always Manny. But yeah, you can go. It's the way you pronounce it.
We usually wait a couple of minutes because we have this kind of tradition to.
And we have a lot of time, so we can wait. It's the last presentation, right? So. See, could we wait?
Thank you. Yeah, no, it would be useful if it works out.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, no, because you're in the same position.
Yeah.
¿Empezamos ya? Sí, okay. Okay, I think we can start. There's a small announcement. We won't have the last session today because the speaker is stuck in the airport, and will take place tomorrow. So Douglas Blue presents tomorrow, and there will be some rearrangement of the sessions. Do they get an email with the new program?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So you get an email with the updated. I think they will cut the speaking. Well, the whole presentation time for 15 minutes, the sessions. And so, it's my pleasure to introduce Manuel Rodeiro. He will be speaking about transitional justice and socioeconomic inequality. And he's a PhD student at the City University of New York, in working in the broad area of socio-political philosophy, and maybe as a thesis on inequality. And he has a training in law, also in New York and Fordham. And the comment will be made by our Raúl Ibarra from Ibarra, from the Institute, and who is doing his thesis of the licenciatura, which is here a little bit more than the bachelor and not quite the master, on civic virtues, and will also continue to work on political philosophy in his master's. Okay, so I give you the floor.
Great, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for setting up the conference. I'm very happy to be in Mexico City, even though I wish it was a bit warmer. I was hoping for that. What are you going to do? So yes, my paper is on transitional justice and socioeconomic inequality. And roughly, I set out this paper to achieve 3 goals. And I must admit that I think that this was a seminar paper that I was a little bit too ambitious on. So I think like each of these goals could probably be a dissertation. So I don't think that I do full justice to at least the first 2, even though I think the third one I do a better job at. So the first goal that we're going to talk about is to demonstrate the causal connection between socioeconomic inequality and occurrence of mass political violence. And I think there's been a long tradition in political philosophy where people had this intuition that there's a link between the two. I'll briefly talk about that. But I don't think that at the end of the day, I'm able to come up with any sort of definitive necessary or sufficient levels of socioeconomic inequality that inevitably lead to violence, right? I do think it's very case by case, and I think a lot more work needs to be done in this very interesting question, and I would like to do that going forward. So the second goal was to try and come up with a tipping point, right? Where if a certain level of socioeconomic inequality was reached, that would be a good chance, right? That there would be, mass violence, that there'd be a chance that mass violence might occur. And the third one is work towards establishing a normative framework designed to ensure adequate levels of socioeconomic equality in post-violent transitional states. And what I think about this third one is in many ways it's about trying to bridge the gap between ideal theory and non-ideal theory, which is something I was talking a bit during lunch, and something that I'm very interested on. And I think the third one's where most of the time will be spent. These first two I'll go over somewhat quickly, and just to try and lay the foundation so everyone can be clear what we're talking about. But most of the focus is going to be on the third one, trying to come up with a normative framework designed to ensure adequate levels of socioeconomic equality after transitions. So as I said, there's a long tradition of assuming the link between mass political violence and inequality. You can go back to Aristotle, where he says the universal and chief cause of this revolutionary feeling has been already mentioned, the desire of equality, when men think that they are equal to others who have more than themselves. So I think Aristotle hits on a really important idea here, that the notion of inequality has to be relational, right? It's that you feel upset that someone else has more than you, that you don't feel they deserve. And so Aristotle, I do think, hits the nail on the head with that relational aspect. Another important figure was de Tocqueville, obviously a child of revolution. Madison also has a similar quote like de Tocqueville, but I'll read the de Tocqueville quote. He says, all of the revolutions which have changed the aspect of a nation have been made to consolidate or destroy social inequality. Remove the secondary causes which have produced the great convulsions of the world, and you will almost always find the principles of equality at bottom. And I think de Tocqueville also hits on a very key point here, that these sorts of mass violence, they can occur in two directions, right? They can be to consolidate power, to consolidate the inequality, and the way I look at that is I call that subjugatory mass violence, right? So it's trying to subjugate the people who are down. But then there's also another type, which is revolutionary mass violence, the group that has been diminished, the group that has been disenfranchised, rising up and overthrowing the people who were, disenfranchised, and that can also lead to mass violence and conflict. I'm not going to read the quote from Adam Smith, but it goes along the similar lines. Also, interestingly enough, Karl Marx references the same intuition, right? That there's a link between inequality and violence. So you have Adam Smith on the one side hand, right? Obviously the firm capitalist. You got Marx on the other, the communist, and they each have this intuition that there's a link between mass violence and inequality. So there's a long tradition in political philosophy. So before we move on, I feel it would be good to talk about transitional justice a little. So the field of transitional justice, it arose after World War II, so after the atrocities of the Holocaust, when states were trying to rebuild in this period. That's when the traditional justice project got off the ground. There have been other distinct phases in this process. The decolonial period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was hugely influential in forming the conceptions that transitional justice is concerned with. Also, the fall of the Soviet Union and the turn of the Eastern Bloc, so the Eastern Bloc countries from communist authoritarian regimes to more democratic capitalist regimes, that played an important role in the development of transitional justice, and still ongoing today. Basically, transitional justice is the objective of moving a state from a failed socio-political system that engaged in and permitted grave social harms, and instead moving towards a society that respects the rule of law, affords fair and equal treatment to all citizens, engenders civic connectedness, and strives to establish reciprocal trust both institutionally and individually. And you guys can read the quote from the International Center for Transitional Justice explaining what their project is. I think one of the key ideas that transitional justice is most focused on is the idea of never again, right? Oh, okay. A little slower? Yeah. Oh, sure. Otherwise... Yeah, I will do my best, try and slow down. I'm a fast talker, I do apologize. Okay, so transitional justice. Historically, the discipline, they had ignored topics of economic inequality. And there were some reasons for that that we'll get into in the next couple slides. But Schmid, he lays out well, explaining how transitional justice has just ignored this topic of economic inequality. And he thinks that this is problematic, but not all scholars in the discipline agree with him on that topic. So here are some of the reasons why transitional justice ignored inequality. There's first that there was a fear that discussing inequality would lead to the appearance of providing a justification for why these grave wrongs have occurred, right? So they're thinking that if you give a story that, hey, look, inequality is the root of this issue, you're kind of justifying it. And so there was a worry in the discipline. They didn't want to provide any justification for why these occurred, so they avoided discussions of inequality for that reason. The field also historically was oriented towards legal and political theory. And you can see that with its very beginning, like the Nuremberg trials. That's one of the key seminal moments in the history of transitional justice. Obviously, it was a legal proceeding, right? So generally, they've been worried about legal issues, political issues, civil rights concerns, and inequality issues kind of sat on the backseat. Also, there's a group of transitional scholars. Waldorf is a good example of this, who writes that he advocates a narrow reading of transitional justice. They make an instrumental case for excluding socioeconomic rights by expanding transitional justice too broad. Social and economic concerns, they argue, we risk framing it with expectations so overly stretched and impractical as to make the whole project meaningless. So they think that if you add in socioeconomic issues to the transitional project, ultimately, you're not talking about anything in particular. You're just talking about governance in general. And they're like, that's not what this field is about. This field is about a specific topic, and we need to stay with the narrow reading of this topic. So, some of the problems with the narrow reading are that, so the narrow reading, once again, is one that says transitional issues are predominantly based in ethnic, racial, and political concerns, and thus socioeconomic inequality is not germane. But the problem with this is recent events have challenged this view. So we can look at Muhammad Bouzid, I apologize for the pronunciation, I do not know Arabic, but Muhammad Bouazizi. He was the person who set the Tunisia revolution on fire and kind of started the Arab Spring movement. And he was protesting not against civil rights or political abuses, but the taking of his cart that he used for his own livelihood, right? So the thing that he used for his well-being, the government of Tunisia took his cart, and that kind of sparked the revolution. Other examples are, we can look at the 2011 revolutionary motto of Egypt. The motto is bread, freedom, and social justice. Obviously, bread comes first, right? An inequality issue. Another example would be the conflict in Ukraine, the one that started in 2013. The reason that started was an unsigned trade agreement, right, between the Ukrainian government and the European Union. Once again, a socioeconomic issue. So we can see lots of examples where it's not just ethnic, racial, or political concerns, right? It seems like socioeconomic issues are really kind of driving why these conflicts are occurring in our present society. Another interesting point that challenges the narrow reading, there's been empirical studies. McCullough, he does a good job of laying out a lot of these studies where he actually interviews survivor population, and he questions them, he speaks with them, and overwhelmingly, where their concerns are during the transition are with socioeconomic issues. They're more concerned with that than trying to, dealing with criminal justice issues or truth and reconciliation. Most of them are complaining that, hey, we need water access, we need food access. And so McCullough's done a lot of investigations showing that the people on the ground are very much couching their concerns during transitions in socioeconomic terms. Another important historical fact that has arisen multiple times is that when transitions end without adequately addressing the socioeconomic needs, this failure has tragically, there's been lots of instances when this failure has tragically ushered in new cycles of violence. right? New cycles of violence have arisen. Some examples of that would be, you can see it in Chile, Argentina. There's also some African examples off the top of my head. They're Rwanda. You can even look to that example. South Africa is another good example. So you can see instances where the socioeconomic issues, they're not dealt with. There can be recurrences of violence in the future. And that would undermine the never again motto that transitional justice is so concerned with. So one of the last reasons that transitional scholars have used to argue for the narrow reading and excluding socioeconomic concerns is that there's been a lot of studies in the social sciences showing that there's no empirical link between the relationships of inequality generally and violence. Right? That there's no real link between inequality and violence. And this goes against the entire long history in political philosophy, thinking that there's obviously an intuitive link between these things. But the empirical studies done in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they weren't able to confirm this. And I do think there's a reason why they weren't able to confirm it, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But some of these transitional scholars were able to point to this fact that there was no empirical evidence between a link between mass violence and socioeconomic inequality as a reason why they should not be concerned of it in transitional states. So the problem with these empirical studies is they were all based in vertical inequality. And vertical inequality, the way it works is it utilizes the Gini coefficient, right? So all these studies were based in analysis of the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient analyzes individuals, right? So what it looks at is it picks a representative individual for a certain quartile or decile of the population, right? So it picks some percentage, and it takes that person, right? So you can look at the bottom 10% of a country, right? And you can compare that person to someone, let's say, in the top 10%. And you can look at the violence rates between these groups just on the decile and quartile rates. And they didn't actually see any empirical correlation between these deciles. But the problem with looking at it vertical inequality is that since we're dealing with mass political violence, and what the Gini coefficient is good for is looking at just individuals, right? But mass violence is group orientation, right? It's group collective action. You need to look at what's happening at the group level, not at an individual level. So that's part of the problem with looking at vertical inequality. And so what I propose is instead, we should look at horizontal inequality. I think that would be a better indicator of trying to come up with the link between socioeconomic inequalities and mass political violence. And horizontal inequality is actually just taking groups as entireties, right? So you could look at the relationship between men and women and how inequality plays between those groups. You could look at blacks and whites, right? You could look at Jews and Muslims, Hutu and Tutsis in Rwanda, right? You can just divide whatever groups you're interested in comparing and look at, the distinct disparities between those groups. And one of the justifications for studying the group differences is stuff like realistic conflict theory. So Sharif in the 1950s did these great studies called the Robbers Cave experiments, where they took groups of young boys, right, like pre-teenage boys. They divided them in groups. So one team was the blue team, the other team was the red team, and they would compete against each other, right, for the entire summer at the camp. And these studies, every single time they saw an uptick in animosity, an uptick in conflict between the groups, and an uptick in violence, right? And there were multiple years of these studies. They've been retested in multiple different scenarios, in multiple different situations, and there seems to be some link between groups and violence. But the question is look, that's not what I'm arguing here. I'm arguing that it deals with the inequality, right? Maybe someone who's still arguing for the narrow view would just say, this proves the fact that it's just, political orientation or personal identification, right, that's doing the work. It's not the inequality. It's just the fact that we have different groups automatically leads to violence, right? So it's just the fact that certain people are, called this group, they'll be automatically antagonistic against the other group. We just form bonds with the in-group, right? We're antagonistic against the out-group, the other. And so that would have nothing to do with inequality. But I don't think that's the full story here. I do think that inequality is really important because group antagonism doesn't just occur the second you divide two people, in group A or group B. It occurs when there's something at play there, right? When there's something meaningful to be gained by working with the group, trying to undermine the other group. And so I think that's an important point, that there's huge amounts of intersectionality, right? Like, you can look at yourself. There's tons of groups you belong to. And many of those groups have no animosity towards other groups at all, right? It's only once there's actual real substantive issues at play, right, that groups can start having conflict, that groups are more likely to start experience conflict between each other. And there's also empirical data to support that if you do look at horizontal inequality, you can see a link between mass violence and inequality, right? So newer data of people doing studies in the 90s and currently, right, it's looked at instead horizontal inequality instead of vertical inequality, has been able to see a much stronger link. So I do want to just speak a little bit more, and none of this is definitive. I'm not saying that buying this argument, you'll definitely think that, hey, if you have socioeconomic inequality between groups, there will be automatically violence between these groups. But I do think that there are some issues, right, that sociologists and psychologists have been able to study to show that there are some strong reasons why you might think that violence might arise between groups. And I think Gordon Alpert, he did some really interesting investigations showing that diminishing contact between groups fosters animosity, suspicion, prejudice, right, which obviously are precursors to eventually, the probability that violence might be more likely. And inequality, in and of itself, plays a role of segregating groups, right? If certain groups are in a better economic position, right, they might live in different areas. They might go to different schools. They might have different jobs. They might not be as able to engage with multiple members of other socioeconomic positions, right? And because of that, that can lead to the issue of the contact hypothesis, right? That they're just going to have less experience with each other. They're going to be more suspicious of each other. They're going to have less understanding between the groups. And it's the inequality that can kind of breed that segregation and that separation between the groups. So I think that's important to keep in mind. There can be a feedback there. Also, lots of psychological studies have shown a link between stress levels and increased rates of anger and increased rates of violence. So stress, one thing that I think all of us know, if you don't have a lot of money, right, you're going to go into more stress. If you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, you're going to be under a lot of stress. And that, obviously, because of the psychological links that have been shown, that shows that maybe there's a greater propensity for violence. Also, lack of recognition has been shown to lead to frustration, to lead to violence. And one of the things that in capitalist societies is the predominant form of social recognition is wealth, right? So if you are at an incredibly lower level economically than other people in your society, right, you might feel lack of recognition, which studies have shown has led to animosity. Another thing is that once you keep a group isolated, right, if you keep it intact and not able to contact other groups, group polarization can occur. And examples of this are, you can take a lot of people, they've done studies where you take a group of right-wing people, right, and you put them all in a room. And like, think about this social issue. You guys brainstorm what a solution is. They interview them prior to putting them in the test group together, and they have certain positions. After they've all spent some time talking with each other, their positions become more radicalized. They become more extreme, right? So if you keep people isolated and integrated with only like-minded thinking, right, it can lead to more radicalization, which ultimately could lead to mass violence. There's also a psychological vicious circle here, where because certain groups might be in worse positions, it can feed into this idea that this group is inferior somehow. That this group, they brought about their own, diminished social position, and it's their own fault that they're in this place. And because of that, you kind of can justify taking more from them, right? So you can use that to breed the vicious circle, which will only then put that group in a worse position, right? Which will only further the psychological vicious circle. So those are some of the negative, the feedback loops that can lead to this relation between inequality and mass violence. So inequality. Why is inequality justified in society? Obviously, you could talk about this forever, but one of the main arguments is, look, you need inequality because it expands the social pie. If you give certain jobs, right, higher pay, it will motivate people to go into them. Those jobs have a proven track record of expanding the social pie. Thus, the inequality is justified for those reasons because you're increasing the overall, social resources in that society. Kind of a classic capitalist argument. The problem with that is that only justifies the beginning of the inequality. Once you have the inequality in place, you need to put in place maintenance mechanisms to keep it that way, to sustain it. And the maintenance mechanisms, they're not justified by that quick justification story that I just laid on the table, right? And just for some examples of maintenance mechanisms, the legal systems, the police force, financial regulations, tax policies, trade agreements, all these things can be used as maintenance mechanisms to maintain the current power structure. And as Bundish states here, socioeconomic disadvantage tends to be reproduced, if not accumulated over generations, right? So there's no self-correcting way to fix this inequality by itself, right? You need to actually take political action. You need to actually do stuff to fix it. And I think Thomas Piketty does a really good job in Capital in the 21st Century explaining how if growth rates ever are below the interest rates, right, inequality inevitably rises. There's no way around it. And usually interest rates are higher than 4%, right? And it's really hard to maintain a growth rate of 4%. Pretty much no developed nation is able to do that consistently. Thus, inequalities are probably likely to grow. And I think Thomas Piketty does a good job of explaining that. So this is now moving more on to point 2. And this was just a very rough and ready way where I was trying to delineate a tipping point, where if society ever reached this level, this severe level of socioeconomic inequality, it might seem more likely that violence would occur. So I was just trying to come up with a formula. I think that this would need to be tested. You would need to do tons of case studies to see if this actually works. I'm not a sociologist. I did not do that, right? I didn't do that at all. I'd be very interested, though, to see how that played out. I think that's an entirely different project. But beyond the quantitative issues, right, I do think there are qualitative determinants, right, where if society reaches a point of severe socioeconomic inequality and you start seeing in the general population notions of exclusion, isolation, alienation, irrationality, meaning that the one group doesn't think the society's set up fairly for them, right? And that everything's set up to diminish their social position, to isolate them, to alienate them. If you see these things starting arising in a society and certain segments of the population are, expressing these views consistently, I think that you might have a scenario where violence is more likely. So traditionally, transitional justice, when they were trying to look at how to rebuild a society, when the practitioners were actually trying to come up with, the socioeconomic framework to put in place after, the corrupt regime was taken out of power, most of the time they put in place neoliberal policies. And that probably is a shadow of the Cold War, right? There were Western nations that were the practitioners of the transitional justice regime. They were, pushing their agenda. So I can definitely see the Cold War playing a huge factor in this. But there's a problem with the neoliberal policies, right? Pulling money from, public institutions, public sectors, trying to privatize everything, it can lead to social disruption, right? It can lead to the breakdown of these really important social institutions that helped impoverished groups be able to maintain themselves. So this policy that transitional justice actually used for most of its history could lead to greater insecurity, could lead to many of the issues that were listed on the other page that could tip the scales, right, and make it more likely the inequality would lead to violence. So I think that's a problem with the neoliberal approach. So what I proposed was to look at a Rawlsian approach. And the reason I decided to look at a Rawlsian approach is I think, at least currently, if you're talking about distributive justice, Rawls, he might not be everyone's favorite, but I do think that if you're dealing with the topic of distributive justice, you're going to have to confront John Rawls at some point. You're going to have to talk about Rawls here and there, right? So for Rawls, he has a very nice description of when socioeconomic inequality is justified. Basically, it's the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. The only way socioeconomic inequality is justified for Rawls if it's the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. That's the only reason it gets off the ground, right? And inequality is justified as the absolute benefit of the least advantaged. And Rawls makes it explicit that it's the absolute, not the relative. So he's actually concerned in their levels in just raw accumulation of goods instead of their levels of inequality between groups. And I think he might be mistaken in that. I'm not going to delve into that point further though. But I think there might be an issue with his emphasis of absolute instead of relative. And I think Aristotle hit on that point if we go back to the very beginning. So if we put in place, and Rawls is obviously dealing with ideal theory, which we will talk about later. But let's just hypothetically suppose that ideally we were able to put in a perfect Rawlsian distributive system. If we were, right, the least advantaged, none of these issues of distrust or alienation would arise in this scenario, right? Because they would know that every single distributive mechanism or policy or legislation that's put in place is put in place for their benefit, right? That's the Rawlsian framework. That's what Rawls is trying to do. So it would get rid of a lot of those qualitative issues that I think are precursors or you can use to see as potential tipping points towards violence. It would kind of help diminish them. And so ultimately Rawls gives a great quote here, which I'll read. Everyone benefits when the difference principle is satisfied. For the representative man who is better off in any two-way comparison gains by the advantage offered to him, and the man who is worse off gains from the contributions with these inequalities made. So what Rawls is saying is like, look, this system is better than just a purely egalitarian system where everyone gets the exact same amount. Because this provides for everyone in society benefit, right? The people who have more, they're benefiting because they have more. The people who are least advantaged, they're benefiting because they're getting placed in the highest possible absolute social good position that they could be in that society, right? They're put in the maximal position. That's the word Rawls uses. They're put in the maximal position. So the issue is that in transitions, corrective justice plays a very large role. And I think that all of us here, maybe I shouldn't speak for all of us here, but I do think there's a strong intuition that after transitions, or after terrible atrocities during transitions, there ought to be some sort of responsibility, and there ought to be a drive to redress past historical inequities, right? So to repair the wrongs of the past. And Jeremy Waldron does a good job of explaining what the objectives of corrective justice are. It's to try and take action in the present that will reorient our relationship with the past, right? So taking steps in the present that will reorient our relationship with the past. I think that's really the core of what corrective justice is. But there's an issue with that if we're limited to a Rawlsian approach. Rawls is ahistorical. He's talking ideal theory, right? He asks us to go behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. And that's designed to render irrelevant personal considerations, right? So behind the veil of ignorance, you're not supposed to know what race you're a part of, what class you're a part of, what gender you're a part of, what age you are. You're not even supposed to know how your society was previously structured, right? So all those past historical wrongs, they're not on the table behind the veil of ignorance. You're not supposed to know how your society historically was previously structured. And so that can pose a real problem because the Rawlsian framework neutralizes the individual's ability to consider their past and present conditions, which is incredibly relevant when we're dealing with transitional states, where the past is hugely relevant for figuring out what is fair and what is just, right? because there's obvious distinctions between the victims and the perpetrators of these atrocities in transitional states. And because of that, I think we have this intuition that the victims need to be afforded, special consideration, right? And the Rawlsian framework makes it very hard to be able to get that off the ground. So I initially set out to see if there was a way to accommodate the issues of reparative justice and corrective justice into the Rawlsian framework. And I think that in most cases, we'll see that there's a strong correlation between members of the least advantaged, right, and the victims of the grave historical wrongs, right? So we'll see that if we're looking at a Venn diagram, right, there'll be a lot of overlap between the least advantaged and the victims. But that's not always the case. And for Rawls's theory to fully accommodate the reparative concerns and the corrective concerns, we need all victims of grave historical injustice to actually be members of the least advantaged. So I'm going to try and work through to see if that's possible, where if we're actually able to come up with that. Ultimately, this is going to be a dialectical argument, where I'm going to try and work out whether or not Rawls's system is able to accommodate these corrective justice concerns and include all victims of the historical injustice as members of the least advantaged. I do think that he is able to do that, but then I think that that's not a viable solution as is, right? So it's a dialectic argument. I'm going to argue whether or not he can. Ultimately, I'm going to reach the conclusion that yes, he probably can, but that still isn't the way we should ultimately go. So that's just foreshadowing of where the argument is going. And if all the members of the grave historical injustices are not included as the least advantaged, we reach a problem where the victims, they wouldn't be afforded by the difference principle, right, any extra social resources. Thus, that would defeat the requirements of corrective justice and foreclose the prospect of an ideally just transition, right? So all the victims do have to be included somehow here, otherwise you forego an ideally just transition. So here's the problem example, and I mentioned before that you need all the victims to be included, but there's an issue, privileged victims. And I know that's an oxymoronic term, but I do think that it best illustrates the problem case. And the privileged victims are ones that are in a better socioeconomic position than the general population, right? So that's the issue. Why do these privileged victims deserve special consideration during transition, right? What should be afforded to these privileged victims? And I'm going to lay out a bit more who the privileged victims are. But before that, I want to talk about Rawls' notion of the least advantaged. And Rawls admits that trying to define the least advantaged is one of the hardest parts of his theory. As the quote here, the serious difficulty with the difference principle is how to define the least fortunate, right? How to define the least advantaged. He initially gives two formulations. One is the social position formulation. And this says, choose a particular social position, say that of the unskilled workers, and then to count as the least advantaged, all those with average income and wealth of this position. So you pick some demographic, you pick some group, right? You label that social position the least advantaged. Everyone who has that level or worse, they're considered the least advantaged. That's the social position formulation. The other is the relative income and wealth formulation. And this is all persons with less than half of the median income and wealth may be taken as the least advantaged segment. So these are the first two definitions that he provides. But there's a problem with this definition in trying to get all of the potential victims of historical atrocities into the least advantaged, because it's possible that per both of those definitions, victims in certain settings may constitute a privileged segment of the transitional setting, right? Ultimately, they won't fall into these two categories of least advantaged, right? So that's the issue. And so we can imagine a situation where the victimized group is not included within the socioeconomically disenfranchised. There are historical examples of this. The Hutu and Tutsi is a great example, looking at the Rwandan genocide. The Tutsi were a heavily privileged class. In fact, Mamandani, he actually says that to be Tutsi was to embody privilege itself. he gives I wish I actually had the quotes in front of me. They're pretty vivid, explaining the relationship between the Tutsi and Rwanda and the Hutu in this period. But unfortunately, I do not have it in front of me. And there are other examples too. That the Igbo in Nigeria, they were a privileged group that grave atrocities were committed against. You get the Chinese in Malaysia. You can also even look to post-World War II reparations and discuss those. So we do have historical examples where the privileged group, right, is the group that the grave atrocities were committed against. But not only that, right? It's also after these atrocities, these groups can return to their privileged positions. So the Tutsi, they had the genocide committed against them, but right after the genocide, they rose back to power, right? They still now are in power in the Rwandan government, right? They have the privileged positions. They pretty much run the show in Rwanda to this day. So they're doing well for themselves, socioeconomically, right? And so is there a way where Rawls can expand his definition? And Rawls actually does, later on, provide a much expanded definition of the least advantaged. And he clarifies that he was unsatisfied with limiting the determination of the least advantage to possession of economic goods, and opted to admit that all primary goods should be up for consideration when we're figuring out who the least advantaged is, right? There's Rawls' quote stating that it needs to be based on measure of primary goods. So what is a primary good for Rawls? Primary goods constitute a comprehensive index of rights, liberties, opportunities, income, and wealth. Essentially, they're the things that all of us would want to lead a good life, right? It's very broad. They're things that every rational man is presumed to want. These goods normally have a use whatever a person's rational plan of life is. That's Rawls' exact quote explaining what primary goods are. And he thinks that self-respect plays a central role in our analysis of primary goods. He thinks it's one of the primary goods of utmost importance. There's Rawls' quote stating the importance of self-respect as a primary good. And Rawls' emphasis of the centrality of self-respect makes it conceivable that even individuals with incredibly high economic standing can still be among the least advantaged, right? Because it's very conceivable that individuals' monetary worth, right, their social position, their socioeconomic position, could very much diverge and be separated from their internal self-worth, from their self-respect. We can imagine that, right? You can imagine someone who has a ton of money but has very low self-respect, right? And so because of that, because of this expanding of the notion of the least advantaged beyond just economically disenfranchised to include notions like self-respect, it's possible that even victims and descendants of victims of human rights violations who are doing well economically, and their self-respect and dignity may suffer, because we can include self-respect in it, it's possible that all victims can be considered the least advantaged, right? And so because of this, I think that I make the argument that Rawls' theory by itself, if we take this expanded view of the least advantaged and we include primary goods of self-respect in this equation, right, it would be possible to include every single victim of a past historical wrong as a member of the least advantaged. Right? I do think that Rawls' theory can meet that objective if someone wants to go that direction. But I find that problematic because most transitional states are in suboptimal economic positions, right? They're not generally doing that great economically. There's very few examples of transitional states that are at the pinnacle of economic development, right? And because of that, how do we justify, right, distributing social resources to people who are doing well socioeconomically, these privileged victims, right, that oxymoronic term that I'm forced to use, while others are ignored. Others with real socioeconomic issues are ignored, and they're not having those resources distributed to them. Instead, the resources are going to these privileged victims. And so the dilemma is a capacious view of the least advantaged theoretically ensures satisfying the demands of reparative justice. But in a society with resource limitations, there are various conflicting distributive concerns vis-a-vis others in poor socioeconomic conditions. And thus the problem is that how do we deal with these competing social issues, right? The peoples who are in poor socioeconomic positions versus the corrective justice issues of the privileged victims, right? So, yeah, as I said, it theoretically can ensure this, it can meet this goal, but because of the resource limitations, I'm not sure this is the way to actually go. And I think the problem is that it causes the difference principle to kind of be schizophrenic. The difference principle now has to, by itself, satisfy way too many social justice issues, right? It has to be responsible for distributive concerns, for corrective concerns, for reparative concerns. It just has too much on its plate, right? And so I think that maybe it's better to go back to a narrow assessment of the least advantaged, go back to a more traditional reading where it's based on income and wealth, right? And this will allow the difference principle to focus on resolving socioeconomic worries, which it's very well suited to do. And such a decision, it carves out a conceptual space where corrective justice can concentrate on the wide range of non-socioeconomic reparative requirements, right? Things like rehabilitation, revival of the victimized group culture, collective group needs. And I think this is important because individuals might be doing well on their own, right? But if it's the group that's harmed, no individual can by themselves revive a culture. You need the entirety of the group to do well. So being able to come up with these reparative mechanisms that will allow, group-oriented distribution of resources, right, to help out, to revive the culture, to revive the group's self-respect, to do these things at a group level, I think is very beneficial. So what I just proposed, and this is real quick, I'll just run through it really fast. This is not fleshed out at all. I think that there should be targeted reparative distributions, right? So you actually give specific distributions to people to meet the needs of corrective justice. There's benefits to this. It signals to the affected group that their harms are taken seriously and that they've not been forgotten by society, and it shows that society is trying to make amends. They're efficient, right, because you're giving it to the group directly and you're entrusting them for handling their own reparative concerns. It's making sure that their needs are actually met because they're the ones now who are handling these issues themselves, right? It allows an opportunity to express themselves, which can increase the group's inherent self-respect, so I think that's a good thing. And each payment is a symbolic social commemoration, right? Each one of them represents a chance for society to show, hey, we're signaling that we're trying to make amends, we're signaling that we're trying to correct our past historical wrongs. And while a lot of this hasn't been fleshed out and developed, I do hope in the future to do more work in this area and try and flesh out a lot of these issues. I do think it's a very important issue that we have to deal with today because there are so many states right now that have grave historical wrongs, and we need to figure out ways to look to the future, right? Look to fair distributive mechanisms, but also look to dealing with these past wrongs, right? And making sure that they are dealt with adequately. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I think what we can now do is take probably 2-3 clarificatory questions, and then take the questions of content after Raúl made his commentary. So is there any question just for clarification of something you didn't understand?
Hope it was kind of clear. I've bit off a way too large of a topic.
Until he says.
Can you talk a little more about how these vertical inequality measurements work, and why do you think they are flawed?
Oh, so the problems with the vertical inequality and why I think they're problematic? Yeah. So the issue is all those analysis, they all relied on the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient, it's picking out a respective individual member, right, from a certain, whatever that percentage might be of the respective entire population of a society, right? So you're picking out one individual, and you're looking at, so you use Gini coefficients to look at a lot. You can use it to look at education levels, you can use it to look at crime levels, you can, whatever thing you're interested in looking at. So the studies that looked at violence, right, they saw no correlation between levels of vertical inequality and perpetuation of violence. But that's probably because violence occurs in all segments of a society. It's not just only one decile has violence rates. And so if you look at an historical example, well, not historical, you look at a theoretical example, right? You could have a group that has members in the lowest quartile, but also in the highest quartile. And because we're dealing with issues of mass violence, right? That's collective group action. We need to look at group analysis here, not individual analysis, which the Gini coefficient focuses on. So I think that's the problem. And interestingly enough, the second they moved to analysis of horizontal inequality, they started seeing a correlation between violence and, so yeah.
Maybe explain what you mean with violence, or what's the scope?
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good point. So, and I didn't say that before and I should have. So what I mean here is mass political violence, crimes against humanity. The definitions that I would use for that, you can look to the UN definitions, the International Criminal Court definitions, the International Tribunal definitions of what these crimes against humanity are. But generally, it's genocide, it's ethnic cleansing, it's mass killings, the gravest wrongs possible. And so they did see violence of like petty crime, right? One-off murders, but they didn't see any correlation of these mass violence, right? Mass violence is what we're talking about here. These crimes against humanity. And there was just no evidence of that until you move to a horizontal inequality model. Yeah, so thank you.
So,
well, first, I want to thank you, Manuel, for your presentation. And
thank you for the comments, also.
At the beginning of his paper, Manuel says that it sets out to achieve three goals. First, demonstrate the causal connection between socioeconomic inequality and occurrences of crimes against humanity. Second, determine a socioeconomic inequality tipping point that, if maintained, augurs crimes against humanity. And third, work towards establishing a normative framework designed to ensure adequate levels of socioeconomic equality in transitional states in which crimes against humanity has occurred. I have comments on the first and the third goals. Regarding the first goal, I think it is not clear what Manuel means by causal connections. It seems that he does not mean that socioeconomic inequality is a direct cause of crimes against humanity, as he says that there is no constant scalar correlation in which every increase or decrease in horizontal socioeconomic inequality is reflected by a corresponding increase or decrease in violence, and that without a triggering event such as an assassination of political prominent figure. Assassination of political prominent figure, terrorist attack, murder of an innocent victim. States can maintain dramatic levels of socioeconomic inequality without any occurrences of crimes against humanity. It seems, instead, that Manuel means that socioeconomic inequality provides much of the background structure that made it likely that once a trigger event transpired, widespread and systematic aggression would follow. I think this is an empirical claim that needs support of concrete examples. However, Manuel does not provide any concrete example of how this has been, or how it could be the case. On the other hand, there are many paradigmatic cases of crimes against humanity in which it seems that horizontal socioeconomic inequality did not play a substantial role in its occurrence. Instead, it is thought that these cases were due mainly to extremist ideology and ethnic animosity. Here I mention three of these cases. The first one is familiar to all of us, the Holocaust, in which 6 million of Jews were killed. In this case, Nazi Germans and Jews were not living in a background of horizontal socioeconomic inequality that would promote the occurrence of the Holocaust. On the contrary, it seems that racial ideology was the main cause of the Holocaust, in which Nazi Germans considered the Aryan race to be superior than the Jewish one, considered that the latter was a bacteria that was poisoning the former, and as a consequence, that the extermination of the Jews was the final solution to the juris question. The second paradigmatic case of a crimes against humanity in which horizontal socioeconomic inequality did not play a substantial role is the Rwandan genocide in 1994, in which an estimated of 1 million Tutsi people were killed by members of the Hutu majority. It is true that there has been political rivalry between these two populations since at least the 17th century. But this rivalry has not caused one group having much more resources or opportunities than the other. For instance, when the Rwandan genocide started, both Hutu and Tutsi people occupied high positions in the government and belonged to high classes. Moreover, many other Tutsi and Hutu people live side by side in small towns, which enables the former to easily target the latter. And this is a case in which suspicions and prejudice were fostered without socio-geographic separation, contrary to what Manuel says in his paper. Therefore, it seems that the Rwandan genocide was caused mainly by the ethnic animosity between the Hutu and the Tutsi, and not because of a background of horizontal socio-economic inequality between these two groups. The third paradigmatic case of crime against humanity is the Cambodia genocide, carried out by the Khmer Rouge regime led by Pol Pot between 1975 and 1979, in which an estimated of 3 million people died. The Khmer Rouge attempted to create a form of agrarian socialism founded on the ideas of Stalinism and Maoism. As a result, the main policy of the Khmer Rouge was for relocation of the population from urban centers, the cities, to rural communities, the countryside. It was in this forced relocation that approximately 25% of the Cambodia population died, due to the combined effects of torture, mass executions, forced labor, malnutrition, and disease. As mentioned, the main target of these atrocities were people living in the cities, that is, people belonging to middle and high classes. And the poor peasants were generally favored by the Khmer Rouge policies. However, there was no conflict between classes, but only the attempt to implement Pol Pot's idea of an agrarian socialist utopia. Pol Pot himself came from a middle-class background, and he adopted these socialist ideas while he was a member of a communist group known as the Marxist Circle in France. Thus, it seems that the main cause of the Cambodian genocide was the extremist ideology of Pol Pot. If there was horizontal socioeconomic inequality at all in Cambodia before the genocide, it did not foster neither revolutionary violence from the underprivileged groups nor radical subjugatory social engineering from the privileged ones that would cause the massive genocide. I know that these cases do not strictly constitute counterexamples to Manuel's claim, because it is possible that horizontal socioeconomic inequality does play a substantial role in other occurrences of crimes against humanity. However, Manuel needs to provide this other type of cases to support his empirical claim, as the examples mentioned above seem to support other kind of explanation, namely that occurrences of crimes against humanity are due mainly to extremist ideology and ethnic animosity, and not to a background of horizontal socioeconomic inequality. Sorry. Regarding the third goal, Manuel claims that a normative framework that adopts Rawls' difference principle and a principle of reparative income guarantee would ensure adequate levels of socioeconomic equality in transitional states in which a crime against humanity has occurred. He offers a myriad of reasons to argue that a reparative income guarantee is necessary to achieve corrective justice. Among these reasons, I think an important one is that a reparative income guarantee allocations express that the state values the inner world of the survivors as living legacies. I agree with Manuel that material reparations are expressive activities, in the sense that they convey certain messages or attitudes. Reparations are truly reparative only if they convey messages or attitudes that are intrinsically variable to those who receive them. In your paper, you claim that a reparative income guarantee conveys an attitude of valuing the inner world of the survivors as living legacies. which of course is an attitude that is intrinsically valuable to the victims. However, it is not always the case that material reparations convey messages or attitudes that are valuable to the beneficiaries. If not accompanied by other elements of transitional justice, material reparations can be seen as an attempt on the part of the state to buy the silence or acquiescence of the victims and their families, turning the benefits into the so-called blood money. Thus, for reparative income guarantee to convey the intrinsically valuable messages and attitudes that Manuel wants, it should receive the proper uptake on the audience to whom they are directed. To receive the proper uptake, the state should be sensitive to how a policy of reparative income guarantee would be received by the parties to whom it is directed. If the state is insensitive to that audience or oblivious to what they need or what they expect, its message is going to fail as a valuable expressive message. Manuel does not tell us much about this expressive aspect of reparation in his proposal of a reparative income guarantee. And I believe he needs to explain us how we ensure that a reparative income guarantee will receive the proper uptake on the audience to whom it is directed, and won't, for instance, be regarded as blood money to buy the silence of the victims. In his paper, Manuel suggests some ideas on how to address this last concern. For instance, he claims that an adequate reparative income guarantee allotment act to support activities and institutions that are vital to the healing process. For instance, a reparative income guarantee should provide resources so that the art and culture of the violated groups have the opportunity to reestablish itself. Similarly, the victim should have the means of enacting fitting memorialization, which is a vital part of the transitional healing process, since it allows groups to mourn, honor, and commemorate the past. That is, he suggests that a reparative income guarantee should support recognition-driven measures. It is important not to interpret this suggestion as saying that victims themselves, with the money they receive from the government, should establish the required recognition-driven measures. This interpretation obfuscates the relation between a reparative income guarantee and other elements of transitional justice, as well as the state and society's role in rectifying historical injustice. Instead of allowing the establishment of recognition-driven measures, a reparative income guarantee should be accompanied by them. For instance, a reparative income guarantee can be accompanied by official apologies, the establishment of days of commemoration, the creation of museums and parks dedicated to the memory of the victims. And of course, these recognition measures ought to be implemented mainly by the state, as well as backed up by society at large. By so doing, it is much more likely that economic compensation will receive the proper uptake on the victims and their families. That is, much more likely that it will be seen as a sincere attempt on the part of the state and society in general to rectify an historical injustice, and much less likely that it will be seen as an attempt to buy their silence or acquiescence. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Is there any clarificatory question for Manuel or Raúl? Okay, so
Do you want me to respond?
yes,
Okay, great.
And then we will have the general questions.
Sure. So, Raúl, I'm very sympathetic to many of your points. I think they're very good. So I'm just going to try to walk through them as you presented them. I might have missed one or two, but I'll do my best to try and hit them. So I agree completely with your first thing, that I do not do a good job of laying out a definitive causal connection between socioeconomic and violence. I think that there needs to be a lot more work there to try and come up with what maybe necessary and sufficient conditions would be. I think that's an entire, book right there. I think that's an entire project. So I agree with you that a lot more work would need to be done on that topic before I could satisfactorily say that I showed the connection. Right? I don't think that I did. I definitely do not think that I did. So yeah, good point. So the other issues, you gave the examples of where there are historical counterexamples to the story I'm trying to say between inequality and political violence. So it was the Cambodians, the Jewish Holocaust, and the Hutu and Tutsi. Yeah. So the Cambodian genocide, I'm not going to discuss just because I don't know enough about it. But the first two, I'm definitely comfortable speaking about those. So I think an interesting thing is when we look at the Holocaust, and if we look at the formula, the way I presented it on when it's likely that violence will occur, right? The genocide didn't occur when the Jews were still the business owners, right? It occurred after they had their business taken over, after they were herded into the ghettos, after their entire way of life was disrupted and destroyed and diminished. So I think that's an example where once they're in that really impoverished economic situation, I think you make the argument that's kind of the story that I'm trying to tell here. They weren't, being killed when they were in that economic position. It was a step-by-step gradual process of their economic diminishment that occurred over years, right? It wasn't an instantaneous change. So that's what I'd say about the Jewish one. I do think you can spin it to fit into my framework. Then with the Hutu and Tutsi, the way I presented it was that there's two ways that inequality can lead to mass violence. So there's the subjugatory violence, where the dominant group, pushes down on the disenfranchised group and it harms the disenfranchised group. But then there's the other example, the revolutionary example. And that's where the disenfranchised group rises up against the dominant group, kills, commits atrocities against them. And I do think that the Hutu-Tutsi example is an example of revolutionary mass violence, where the Hutu, right, they were the disenfranchised group. They actually, rise up and they committed the atrocities against the Tutsi, who were the dominant group at the time. So I think that's the way I would frame the Hutu and Tutsi into my argument. The Cambodian example, I just don't know enough to comment on, unfortunately, so I will avoid that one. So yes, the discussion on reparative income guarantees. So I ended up not being happy with the term reparative income guarantees, and that's not your fault. That was the paper you got. So I actually changed it to targeted reparative distribution. So it's not just like an automatic thing that occurs every year where they get a set amount. It would be more targeted and specific. But I agree with you completely that it could be looked at as blood money. Right? It could be looked at as inadequate. It could be looked at as insulting. Right? There are historical examples where certain groups were given some reparative figure and they turned it down. They're like, we're not accepting this. Right? This doesn't come anywhere near as an adequate reparation for the harms that we've suffered. Right? And so the issue becomes, how can you come up with a figure that works? Right? Maybe you can't. Honestly, maybe there is no amount that could possibly satisfy these issues that these people have dealt with, these grave atrocities. Maybe that's impossible. I still think that it would be beneficial to try, to at least put forth the effort. I do think it's, at the very least, a symbolic display of social signaling that the new government is trying to show that they're not the old government, that they're trying to step forwards, right, to improve the well-being of the affected group of the victims. But I can't guarantee that that would ever be enough for the victims, just to satisfy the reparative concerns of the victims. And I definitely agree with you completely that it should work in unison with all the other reparative mechanisms, right? All those other ones that transitional justice is focused on traditionally, like truth and reconciliation, the memorialization, right? Not just giving out money to the victims. So I do think all of these things are essential in the reparative healing process. And I don't just want to say that this is the only one. I think it should be accompanied with all of them. And I might have not made that clear in the paper. I might have not made that clear enough. But I definitely agree completely with you then. Yeah. So.
I think we can open for the general questions. So 1, 2, and okay. Let's start with this.
I have a small comment on your first point about Rawls' first principle.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, I think there's an extensive discussion on the literature about the real role of that, of the original position on the veil of ignorance, if it's justificatory or if it's heuristic.
Sure.
I think you're taking it as justificatory. On the other, I think this first principle is already impersonal and historical enough for your point. So I don't know, why not make a more direct case?
I would actually be interested in how you think that it is first personal and historical enough to get off the ground the issues in transitional settings. Could you explain that? I'm not sure if I should ask the question back, but I'd actually be interested in hearing. We can talk about it after if you want. I personally am somewhat skeptical of that claim, and that's the reason I don't make a direct argument. I think that it's harder for Rawls to be able to do this, right? I do think that he has to kind of bend over backwards with being able to deal with transitional settings. I don't think it's as easy for him, but I'd be really interested to hear your argument that it is.
Well, I just think it's historical and personal because Rawls thinks that it can be applied up to a lot of kind of societies.
It can be applied to all, ideally, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I think it's impersonal and historical.
Yeah.
I don't really see your point of why it's not historical. So you can tell me more about that.
Oh, so why the veil of ignorance in the original position isn't historical? So
no, about the first principle, not the veil of ignorance.
Oh, but the first principle comes out of the veil of ignorance, right? So I guess that goes back to the earlier conversation that you were asking about how you view the original position of the veil of ignorance. Yeah, so I guess maybe we just disagree on the way to, because I'm viewing it as the first principle really comes out of that, right? And so if that's ahistorical, then the first principle is ahistorical. But maybe not. So yeah, I can definitely see your point. Yeah. So I see where you're coming from.
Okay. Okay, you have many questions, and one for Raúl, if I'm allowed to. Okay, so what I was trying to do is to actually support you and to actually to push you further into your theory, because I think in, let's say, in this context, so close to the Anglo-Saxon sphere, this issue is it's really good that you're working it. I'm coming from a much farther left perspective. So the first concrete question I'm going to ask is, have you tried measuring the other direction? Like, okay, maybe you could try to explain certain disruptions in the social order by saying a social-economic inequality, which is a stress point, and then it explodes into an exceptional moment. But what about the other way around?
Oh, so like systemic violence?
Exactly, where you don't cause crimes against humanity to stop social inequality, but you produce crimes against humanity in order to start social inequality. Because colonization and its history can be seen sort of the lens. And that's why I made the clarificatory question first, because I wasn't sure how violence was measured.
Yeah.
But it seems it's a very suspicious, coming from the left, type of violence, because it ignores completely the ordinary violence of everyday institutions. And that's just crazy. I mean, if you're going to define violence in that specific way, then you're never going to explain systematic, ordinary violence. The one which critics from the left would say we are planning to by ideology. We do not see that as violence because it's been normalized in us. We see it as everyday matter of fact. In Mexico, oh look, 3 more women were found dead and decapitated dumped into a river. Wow, just another day. I mean, that should be considered, when taken into a larger systemic view, a sort of crime against humanity. But it's not measured as such because it's not one huge disruption of the social order. But if you were to tally all the women murders we get in Mexico, we should definitely consider that a crime against humanity. So what about if the causation in this subjugation type of violence goes the other way? You first start with a crime against humanity, you subjugate another people, you take their history, you turn them into slaves, and then you start a mechanism in which you make certain group of people incredibly wealthy by justifying social inequality on imperialistic grounds. Oh, it's okay to enslave them, they are inferior. That makes it okay to steal their land, spoil their culture, and enslave their people. So maybe the causation can go both ways. Maybe it can be, it's sort of historic dialectical relationship between violence and inequality. That's one question. Good.
Should I deal with that one first? I think it's a great question. Okay, so I think that wonderful question. I just want to, I guess, first talk about my project initially off the bat. So it blew my mind when I was reading the transitional justice literature, and they were saying that economics didn't play any role in it. That was my impetus here. I was like, economics clearly plays a role, and that's what got me into this discussion. It wasn't until 2007, after the financial collapse, that socioeconomic issues became a part of the dominant discourse in transitional justice. So that's what I was arguing about and dealing with, was that point, which was just crazy to me, right? You're interesting about systemic structural violence. I think it's spot on. I just think it's a different topic, right? It's not what I was looking at. But I am really interested in the idea that if you look at history, right, especially if you look at colonialism, which has been the dominant history for hundreds of years now, right, it does seem to go the other way. And that's a really interesting story to tell that I hadn't really thought about till you raised it. And I'd love to think more about it. Yeah, so thank you for making me think about that.
Okay, sorry, good question. It's just, there's so much to say about this. I really share your surprise at people saying it's economics has nothing to do with it, which is kind of a question.
Well, just transitional justice scholars.
Yeah.
It was just outside of the sphere that they discussed. They were focused on legal, political, and civil rights issues.
Something I disagree with is that like there's this danger of this economic reparation seen as blood money or efficiency. Okay, I understand that, but there's also another dimension to this payment that has nothing to do with symbolic or civic gestures, but more that has to do with survival. I mean, okay, we're discussing whether people are going to be offended by certain payments, but I'm more concerned with if people are going to survive at all. I mean, sweet, I'm going to take Paul's statement. How will the United States pay reparation for the whole destabilization it has made of the Middle East during the last 50 years? It goes beyond personal offense or symbolic gestures and more to do with the survival of millions of people and cultural legacy that stretches from thousands of years. I mean, it's not just that one has to be wary of how it's going to look, but more of how governments look at people. As long as states treat individuals as means for war or production, no amount of money is ever going to be seen as anything but means to an end, as objectifying or demeaning, because the underlying political view of individuals is one where they are fungible objects. But even in spite of that, we should make every attempt to make reparations in the sense that we need people to live. I mean, we're still operating from the basic agreement that human life has some sort of value beyond production or warfare. So, not sure why we should even be entertaining this public relationship issue. I mean, I think your point was going to be much more on parenting, survival, or basic communities.
Yeah, okay, so I think you're completely right. Generally, the corrective justice concerns will map on seamlessly with the distributive justice concerns, right? I think generally they will go hand in hand. And so when you do distributive justice things, it will help the victims because they are the least advantaged, they are the disenfranchised members of society. So it will work hand in hand. I was just interested in the privileged victim example because that was the hardest one to come up with. So I was trying to figure out how we could still justify doling out social resources to people who are already in, you know, they're already standing strong socioeconomically, right? How can that be justified? So I was trying to work through that a bit. But generally, it will be the case that will go hand in hand. So that issue is less important. One thing to push on is I do think, obviously, we need to think of people as, you know, invaluable objects, not just means to cement. And I think that the liberal tradition, I think, does a good job with that, at least with Kant, with Rawls. I do think they emphasize that point. I think it's one of the strengths of the liberal tradition is that point. But yeah, look, you obviously run into structural issues. You obviously run into huge issues there.
Good. Well, sorry, one moment to spoke for Raúl. I'm sorry. Just that I disagree completely with one of your examples, which is the Jewish Holocaust. I mean, without the historic and economic conditions that Germany had after World War I, it seems highly impossible, not to say outright impossible, to them to submit to fascist ideology. I mean, the impoverished state which Germany had after World War I was what led to this kind of xenophobic, nationalistic, protectionist promises that Germany, that Nazi Germany gave in order to justify its existence. And if you look at the historical record, which I'm sorry, because in the West that part of history has been mostly whitewashed, you'll see that the first public enemy of the Nazi regime was the communists. Before the Jews, there are plenty of propaganda, posters and movies vilifying communists. And if that's not a social economic issue, I don't know what is. So I think actually the Nazi German example and its use of violence, it helps Manuel. It's not just that extreme ideology pops out of nowhere. His point is that social and economic inequality fosters those kind of conditions. People don't become fanatically suicidal in a cause without having nothing to lose. It is that condition of complete abject poverty and despair that opens up for this radicalization of ideology. I mean, we have a great example here in Mexico, narco-culture. You think that people will sell their own bodies and lives as a sicario or hitman without severe economic empowerment? Would you try and murder someone who is probably armed for 500 pesos without it being your ultimate last resort? Yeah, we'll probably talk about that later.
Comment? Answer.
Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree with you that, well, before the Holocaust, there is like a huge historical record on how the Nazis got this ideology against not only Jews, but also communists and other people. But so I agree with you, and I put in like this example just to make pressure on Manuel, like to give us like more concrete examples to explain us more how is that these issues causes like this rivalry, this animosity, and so can cause a crimes against humanity. So yeah, I agree with you.
Are there any further questions?
So I was just so I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about how the appeal to the difference principle was supposed to work, because I thought that you so if I understand how the way it goes is so the difference principle says inequalities are justified only if they're independent of the worse off, right? But it just seems to me that and then the thought is, well, let's try to appeal to that kind of thought to see if we can justify reparations, right? But it just seems to me, I'm just very skeptical that that would ever like get off the ground in the first place, because I think that just not knowing much about the literature, but it just seems that reparations have to do with things that have happened to different groups, right? So it just seems at least conceivable that a group could be better off than any other group on any measure, right? And even though it has been systematically subjected to all sorts of abuses, right? So that society owes them reparation even though they're better off on every measure, right? So I
even self-recognition.
Even I would think so, yeah. I would think, like maybe it's kind of like an unrealistic example, but it seems to me that that you could reach a point, like you can have a bunch of groups, and as it so happens, this group is so resilient that that there's a point in history at which this group that has been victimized for so long is still doing better on any measure that you care to look at, right?
Yeah.
Anything that makes 5-4 flip. So that seems kind of conceivable, right? And in that case, it just seems like that seems relevant, because the question is the question of whether you owe them reparations has to do with what has been done to them, right?
Yep.
So I mean, this is not. I'm not disagreeing, of course, but it's just yeah. So I don't know. Maybe that I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't like misconstruing the dialectic or being uncharitable to people who would appeal to something like the different principle.
So the way I respond to this is be like, look, let's suppose there was this hypothetical group. Let's imagine that. And you said any measure possible, right? So self-respect, happiness, right? Overall well-being. If they're at the top in all those things, I do think it would be somewhat weird to be like, they should be afforded anything else. In that situation, I just don't think the argument gets going, right? They have to be lacking something for them to be afforded. There's nothing to correct. There's nothing to repair if they're already at the upper echelon in all these categories. So I think that you need to have a problem that could get the group to be in the members of the least advantage to get my dialectic off the ground. And if there isn't one thing, then I ask the question, then why would society give them anything if everything's going so great for them?
Well, if sorry, can I?
Yeah, sure.
It's a follow-up. So I was thinking of a case where they're better off than any other group in a society, but they've been affected in such a way that they would be better off had they not been victimized in some way, right? And so that seems to be a matter of justice, right? Like if something has been taken away from them, even though they're still doing great relative to any other group, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. All I would question there's no other group that was harmed more by some other past wrong that maybe has a better claim to that sort of, better justice claim. And potentially you could come up with an example where it's not. I just think that this seems far-fetched to me historically, but it's possible. I agree that it's far-fetched.
But I was just so maybe it's just a disagreement about the scope of the theory. But I thought that the view would have to account for it. Kind of
yeah, and I think that's interesting. I would need to give that one more thought. Yeah, that deserves.
More questions? I do have actually. If no one has a question, actually one kind of two small comments and a question. About the privileged victims, I think there's too much focus on the money issue in economic form. I think one very strong formula for recovering or getting more privilege is, let's say, legal literacy in that part, especially if you focus on the issue on that there's a reparatory process, let's say, international court for crimes against humanity. A small group that has little money but very strong legal literacy will be one that could benefit from that enormously, which doesn't tie so much on the economy part.
Yeah, good point. You don't just need to focus on the economic, you could also look at the legal ability of that group.
This would be, let's say, one very strong issue that could make them.
I think that actually helps my argument with if I have another example, so I think that's good, yeah.
Yeah, no, let's say, this is why this is one comment. The second comment, I think the on the reparation, in at least environmental ethics, what you use a lot is public goods. So in money, giving people money, something that comes with a, let's say that you pay off the crime, let's say blood money, but with a public good, in people are much more open to say yes or to accept it. In the case that, let's say you want to have nuclear waste or something in your village, there's many studies that show that people are much more open to that if it's with something like having an extra park
Or a museum.
Yes,
Yeah.
something like that. So this is
Or just a parade, right?
yeah. So there are many kind of examples as in say not very strict public goods, but in that sense, community public goods. Okay. And the question actually is in. I think your work has a lot of relevance, especially for what's coming up. In one of this socioeconomic rights that will play a big role is the part of means of production, and this could have a strong link with the part of subjectory, being in a subjectory position, because nowadays it makes much more the technology allows some to produce much more than others, and inevitably in the future, if we have extreme inequality and we in the means of production that people have will change a lot in how subject they are. If I can do it with a machinery that work in 1 hour or in 10 hours, it makes a strong change. And in agriculture is the best example for that case, that people, in some areas of the world, people spending 14 hours a day to work to get enough food, and a couple of minutes a day. And this is already leading to a lot of problems of really crimes, major crimes again. And we can see this in the field, let's say in the competition of in Latin America of fields for drug cartels, fields for food production. In the Colombian case with seeds, also some means of production having huge revolts. So I was wondering what your ideas are on means of production and subsidiary relationships, and what role does this play in your argument?
I think that, so I haven't really given it thought for my argument. I do think it's incredibly important. The means of production, right, when we look at inequality, is going to be a driver of who's in what position in society, right, what access they have to what means of production. It's going to be, very, very important. I will say, looking at things like farming, you're saying some people have the ability to produce, a lot of food in a couple minutes. Other people it takes, a week's work, right? The issue is a lot of the people who are able to produce food very rapidly or able to get things done very rapidly, they externalize huge amounts of those costs, right? So they're taking advantage of these things that aren't even, right now being properly monetized. And so maybe these other groups, right, who are taking longer to do the jobs, but they're doing it, more, ecologically sound, they're doing it in a more sustainable way. If we externalize costs properly, maybe things would level out and people would be on a much more level playing field. But ultimately, with my argument, I just haven't thought enough through it. I think means of production and levels of inequality is really important. I just haven't thought it through yet.
So, any last questions? No? And I think, we're almost to the end, and I should remind you that there's no last session for those few, I think almost nobody came late. And so I think we already received an email with a new plan, or comes there. And yeah, I think this is it for today, and thanks for listening, thanks for the questions, and thanks
for the questions, everyone.